Okay, are we up?
And Chris,
All right.
She's a longtime friend of mine. I mean, Chris.
Okay.
Chris and I have known each other for a very long time.
That's what I.
This is an enthusiastic bunch post-lunch. Hopefully we can keep it going that way. I think we're going to go ahead and get started with the next session. I'd like to welcome you all to this conversation about a rather substantial topic. And first, just thank the conference organizers for the opportunity to be here. It's a real honor to moderate this conversation, this topic, and to interact with these folks here, to really delve into what is one of maybe the most important issues that we have to face in the context of climate change, which is equity and how to equitably share water resources. So the panel session today is entitled Strategies to Equitably Share Water. And I really lingered over that title, Strategies to Equitably Share Water. The first word is strategies. But my question was, what's the problem that these strategies are going to solve? And the problem is equitably sharing water. Equitably sharing water relies on a deep understanding of equity. And I feel like we can only really fully begin to talk about strategies 7 or 8 steps down the road, after we have a fairly robust conversation about what equity is. Equity, I think, is one of the most oft-used words in this meeting, but a word that bears significant defining. And there's a question about how we come together as a group to figure out what equity means and where we even begin with this conversation. We've talked a lot in this meeting about the politics and the policies, the histories and the processes that have led to inequity. And it is these policies and processes that we need to change in order to strive for greater equity. So it's not the place that we begin this conversation. Defining equity is the first place that we start, which is where we're beginning this session today. And language is really our tool for charting a common understanding and mapping the world that we wish to create. And today, we will harness the power of the English language. But I think that we would be very well served to also investigate this conversation in the languages that are indigenous to this place and the people that are indigenous to this place. Today, however, this conversation will take place in English. I hope that we can have a future conversation in other languages. So equity means different things to many different people. And I think there are 3 places where we can place our feet as we begin to talk about equity. And the first place is a notion of reciprocal recognition. In equity, it relies on our own desire to be seen as part of the conversation about equitably distributing water resources or water supplies. But in order to be seen, we have to reciprocate and see. We have to see things that we previously have not understood or not stretched or endeavored to see. And in this sense, in seeing, we recognize. And I think it's important to recognize that equity is really rooted in this reciprocal recognition. The second place we could place our feet in this conversation is to acknowledge that equity is really about how we relate to one another. We've talked a lot about how the upper basin relates to the lower basin in terms of the Colorado River Compact in 1922 and the equitable distribution of water resources. But today we're talking about many other groups of people who are relating. Big agriculture with a big A, and environment with a big E, and municipalities and tribes with big M's and T's. But within these big groups and these sectors, we are relating to each other within these groups. There are different types of agriculture, different types of municipal uses. And within those groups, we are relating to each other. And then collectively, we are relating to the water itself and to the impacts that climate change has on those water resources. So equity at its base is how we relate to one another. And then the third thing is that this is really beyond an intellectual and a political issue. It's beyond the intellectual instinct we have to fall back on technical conversations about equity. I think we've seen in this conference with Jennifer Pitt and Nora McDowell's comments yesterday that really equity is an emotional issue, and that we have more power to relate when we bring the emotion with us and when we talk about equity as an emotional issue, as reflecting the grief and loss and memories of the past, but also the emotion of the fears and the hopes for the future. This is what we're trying to bring to the conversation when we talk about equity. And acknowledge that no matter what, even if we don't say it, we're bringing emotion to the table. So our panelists here are going to begin to unpack this issue of equity with two questions that we'll start off with. The first is, how do they see equity from their perspective? And their perspective as a human, as a person who lives in this basin, and as a person who, through their career, has particular interests. And then propose a few of their own strategies that they've been mulling around, maybe getting a little bit of the cart before the horse to talk about strategies as we're defining equity, but to propose a few strategies that we'll talk about today as well. We'll go through, I'll introduce each of the panelists in a moment, and invite them to share their opening comments, and then we'll ask a couple questions to the panelists, and then I'll refer to the Slido for everybody else's conversation and questions. So with that, our panelists today in order will be Meena Westford, who works with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Andy Mueller with the Colorado River Water Conservation District, Eric Kuhn, who is now an author, Jack Schmidt with Utah State University, and Jay Weiner, a tribal water attorney. Meena, do you want to kick us off?
Can you guess which one of us is Meena?
We need a little diversity on this panel.
Well, and I think this has been a great conference. I really enjoyed myself, but I do think it's striking that we're going to talk about equity. I'm the only person of color on this panel, and throughout the last 2 days, I didn't see a lot of color on this panel, and I think we want to make sure as we're having these conversations, we start to be reminded of the inclusivity and diversity that we need to have equitable conversations. And there were a lot of friends that I haven't seen in a couple years, and I think Brad Udall went down the list of all the folks that we've been working with for about 20 years now. And I invite you all, as we're working through these tough issues, to bring up some younger folks from your organizations to come to these meetings, because I thought that I learned something every time I come to a meeting like this. And I think we need to bring in the younger generation so they can be behind us to learn some things as well. So I put that out to you all today. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to see people, masks or no masks. This is the first conference I've been to in a while. I stopped by CRUA shortly, which is the Colorado River Water Users Association, in December. And so I'm just happy. I feel like I'm happy to be out and about with you. I enjoyed yesterday. I thought it paid homage to our past. It highlighted our interconnectedness, and it showcased that we do have a lot of work to do, and we owe it to the next generation to really roll up our sleeves and put some of that past behind us and look towards the future. But I'm very grateful to have spent almost 30 years of my career in and out and around this river community. I think it's a great community. And there's a few of you, like I know Brenda Berman's over there, who worked on the California Delta issues, and I can assure you that she's probably happier to be back on the Colorado River. They make us look sane. When we were selected for this panel, we were asked to think about what equity means. And as Amy pointed out, equity doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, and it is very emotional. In fairness, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not a farmer. I'm not even a native to this country. I was born in Thailand to Air Force father, so I'm an Air Force brat who moved around the country. But what I'm going to bring to you today is not just my perspective, but the perspective of a municipal water provider, and I have a degree in economics. So when I first heard the word equity, I naturally thought in the terms of investment strategies where equity represents investments, right? And they're provided in exchange for a stake of a company. So in economic terms, equity is important because it represents the value of an investor's stake in a company that's represented by the proportion of its shares. So when I considered how equity fits into a finite resource like water, I look at it from a municipal perspective overlaid with my economics lens. I also considered it from the angle that Metropolitan is a junior water rights user in a state that holds the most senior water rights in the system. So I want to go back to assure you that I use the word finite because that concept, when we talk about equity, is very critical, and we look toward the future, that's also very critical. We must never forget that the Colorado River, as mighty as it is, has limits. We heard a lot yesterday about the river and that it has always been overallocated, and the grim details that we are facing with the impacts of climate change as we look into the future, and particularly the short-term future, and then as we look out another 100 years. According to the Milken Institute of the Public Health at Washington State University, equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances, but is allocated the exact same resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So what's our equal outcome? That's different than equality. Equality means that everyone is treated the same exact way, regardless of their need or their individual difference. Metropolitan's mission statement is to provide its service area with adequate and reliable supplies of high-quality water to meet present and future needs in an environmentally and economically responsible way. Our early founding principle was based on regionalism. Metropolitan was created as a collective because all of Southern California needed supplemental water, and it made more sense for the cities of Southern California to share in the enormous costs of a Colorado River aqueduct instead of building separate water supplies to meet their city's needs. In economic terms, Southern California decided to pool its resources to create an asset that would be shared for the common good. In other words, the economies of scale outweighed independent investments. Metropolitan's regionalism still shares the interdependence and respects the interdependence amongst our 26 very diverse member agencies that rely on us. But from the outset, the members agreed that Metropolitan members would share in the cost of the facilities, that the water would be uniformly priced, regardless of where you're located or your delivery point, and that everyone would be entitled to purchase as much water as they needed. Later, we developed shortage plans that were developed that mandated that all agencies would share equitably in any drought situation. So this idea of sharing resources and costs and taking a collective action at the time in the 1920s and 30s was actually considered very radical. The LA Times editorialized against the formation of Metropolitan. They said it was a radical socialistic approach and did not respect the property rights of the city of Los Angeles. So our approach has always been based on the principle that the rising tide would lift all boats and would bring prosperity to all of Southern California, and not just those that had groundwater basins or access to local rivers. We now have 19 million people in our service area. That's 1 out of every 2 Californians, or bigger picture, 17 people, 1 out of 17 people in the United States. Our economy is over $1.6 trillion annually, making it the 4th largest economy of all states, or the 16th largest in the nation. And so we understand that we've grown and our demand has outweighed our supplies. So we also knew back in 2003 it was going to be taken away, the surplus that we were reliant upon. So we've made extensive investments in local resources, projects, and conservation to reduce the water consumption so that we may more sustainably and equitably share our limited water resources. Amy wanted me to talk a little bit about how we're embarking on a construction of the largest recycled water facility in the United States as a means of converting wastewater that right now heads down into the ocean. We're going to build a 150 million gallons per day project, hopefully enough for 500,000 homes, and if developed would be one of the largest recycled water projects in the nation. The technology, though, or the size isn't really what makes it work. Or makes this project really remarkable. What does is it's a interstate partnership between Southern Nevada Water Authority and Arizona who are supporting and helping finance this project. That's what really makes it unique. It's a perfect example of the big, bold new actions that folks were talking about yesterday and today. But I just want to talk a little bit more about some of our successful strategies. We have a partnership with a small agency, Bard Water District. It's modest in its current size, but it has a very promising example of how farmers with seasonal crops can maximize the value of their water when a crop in the winter commands the best market price, and then sell that water in the summer when a summer crop may not have an attractive market for it. We recently signed a similar seasonal agreement for a pilot program with Kiswan Indian Tribe, and I thank President Joaquin for his leadership. It's a 2-year seasonal fallowing pilot program. I think it's a program that is an example of the partnerships that we need to continue to forge throughout this basin and with our tribal communities. I hope that Jay will talk more about this later. We have also pursued partnerships with Pechanga and Sequan tribes to be a part of the solution, the resolution of their tribal water rights claims, providing them imported water to augment their local supplies and allowing them to also share equitably in the economic success of Southern California. In Palo Verde, we continue to look for innovative ways to make farming more efficient so that fallowing is actually limited and the underlying farming economy remains strong. And our friends in Imperial Valley, we support the ongoing and new efforts to address the human and wildlife impacts of the shrinking Salton Sea. We know that those airborne particulates and restoring lands for key migrating bird species is important to your community, and it's important to our river community. And so these are just a few examples. I could go on and on about how we've been able to successfully move our water and share our water supplies and stretch it to go a little bit longer. But yesterday we heard a lot about the injustices that have happened over the century that have paved the way, that have allowed the way for Metropolitan to be who it is today. There were the indigenous people whose homes were flooded or taken away, as Margaret Vick and Miss Nora McDowell reminded us of yesterday. And as Jennifer Pitt shared, we're constantly threading the needle to try to manage threatened endangered species lest they go extinct and never return. And finally, Carlos de la Parra and my good friend Commissioner Salmon reminded us that we weren't always friendly to the country of Mexico. My friend Daryl Vihol, he brought all this home today in his talk. But I don't believe that the past 100 years represents our value system today. And I don't see a path forward until we add all those disenfranchised voices to the conversation. We have no choice but to evolve. And I do think that the compact allows for that. We cannot afford, again, another economic term, the tragedy of the commons, where one situation in which individuals with access to a shared resource act solely in their own interests, and in doing so, ultimately deplete and destroy the resource. There is only one way to accomplish our goals and address this existential threat of climate change, and that is through a renewed spirit of partnership and collaboration. The stakes are high. Meanwhile, Someone said we have trust. I think the trust is actually low. And so we need to rebuild that. We need to continue to work on some of the successes we've had in the past. But I can't stress enough that regionalism is important. Pooling of our resources are important. John Ensminger said, we are going to all have to take a cut. We are going to have to share in the sacrifice as well. But investing in all of that is for the greater good of all of our parties. So equity and fairness dictate that we develop this approach along the Colorado River where all of the stakeholders share in the benefits of the resource and have a voice at the table. And we must recognize that if the Colorado River was over allocated before, there is even less water to share now, and the risks are much greater. And so that I will pass it on.
Well, thank you, Meena. That was I would say, first of all, I very much agree with much of what Meena has said today. And in fact, talking with Amy about this panel, I said, so you're going to have a bunch of old white guys and Meena talk about equity? I mean, that, and so it is an interesting one. And I think we have to recognize that the historical or the traditional power structure, which gives white men like myself a position of power, is still thriving in the Colorado River Basin and does need to be adjusted. And I think it's going to take recognition of that and action within all of our organizations to change that, and within the organizational structure itself. A little bit about who I am. It's a little funny that I'm here as a representative of ag. I'm an attorney, and the closest I've ever come to agriculture is my backyard garden. And ranchers and farmers throughout the basin will tell you I am not an agricultural person. My district that I lead is in western Colorado. It covers about 28% of the state of Colorado, produces somewhere around 65% of the average water into the Colorado River in the annual flow on an annual basis above Lee Ferry. And we have a thriving agricultural community in western Colorado. And in fact, before taking my position that I'm in now, I was an attorney in western Colorado, primarily representing Western Slope families engaged in agriculture. And so I know a little bit about them, but I will never pretend to be agriculture. I think it is something that I think we need to talk about, right? What is ag? We talk about ag as a sector, and it's really easy to villainize ag. There's 80 to 86% of the water, maybe 70% in Arizona, as we heard from Tom earlier today, is used in ag. And frequently folks engaged in ag say they feel like they're the reservoir for urban growth, right? And they are very skeptical when something like the title of this program is put on the table. Because when we talk about equitably sharing water from the agricultural community, that means, oh, you want to take more of our water away from us. And I think in that respect, agriculture in western Colorado feels a lot, I should say, some of the pain of our Native American tribes, having never been able to develop their water. Speaking of that, who is ag? In my area of the Colorado River, our two biggest agricultural users in western Colorado are the Ute Mountain Utes and the Southern Mountain Utes. When you talk about moving water out of agriculture to balance the river, you have to pay attention to whom you are talking about, right? And so it's not just your traditional white-owned corporations. It is, at least in my region, in western Colorado, it is our Native American population. It is small family operations. In fact, the top 10 water producers or water consumers in agriculture in western Colorado, only consume about 4% of the entire water consumed in agriculture in Western Colorado. So it's a highly diversified ownership. It's very small family operations. It's a very different situation than some of the other areas of our country. We have thriving small family orchards and vineyards and small cattle operations. We have really amazing local, organic operations, and it's really a group of people who feel tremendous pride and ownership about what they do and how they believe they care for the land and the water. They traditionally are looked at, I think, by a lot of people as a very powerful industry and lobby and kind of the traditional power structure. I will tell you, having lots of conversations with agriculture today, they feel this perception of the rural-urban divide is real. They feel very threatened. They are, I would just ask you, and I think I know the answer, but can all the agricultural producers in this room please raise your hand? 2, 3 out of this in this whole conference, right? So it's remarkable that we're here to talk about sharing agricultural water and we don't have ag producers here. And that's not, I'm not blaming the people who set this conference up, but I think it's really important, just as we need, in order to create equity for the tribes, we need to include them at all levels in the discussion. We have to bring in actual people who grow things for a living and produce our food. And along those lines, when you say, hey, 80 to 86% of the water in our basins within our state is consumed in ag, well, who really consumes that water? Every one of us. Every one of us who eats food consume that water. We are all ag. And that's really important to realize when you want to vilify the agricultural industry, or you want to just say, we just want to take a little bit more. We need to take a little bit more. So what is equity in this situation? It's inclusion and it's fairness. I'm not an economist. Sometimes I will say economists scare me when they come into Western Colorado because we have low value ag. And so in a pure market sense, we're the perfect place and the perfect target to dry up to support everybody else in the basin. The discussions about demand management, I've had discussions with economists from Singapore, Stanford, Harvard, hedge funds in New York, all of whom have decided my agricultural producers in my district are the lowest value ag in the area, and they are the ones that should be dried up. The communities that thrive around that agriculture would disagree greatly. It is really important to find fairness in how we deal with this shrinking pie. And I think that's in the essence right here, to me, the recognition that the pie is shrinking. Everybody's been talking about it. I will just say this, let's not continue to make the mistakes that we've heard about in the history of the river. I think I'm deathly afraid that the bottom right now, and you heard discussions of this morning, is 11 million acre feet in terms of what we're willing to plan for. I say we need to plan for much less. I say when the numbers show 9 to 10 million acre feet, that's what we as water planners need to plan for. Our states have to have an agreement. Our participants, all of our participants need to have an agreement that knows how the river is going to operate at 9 million acre foot. Maybe at 10, 11. Go ahead and go all the way up to 17 so that folks who think climate change isn't a thing can see their future as they think it's going to happen. But we've got to plan for that wide variety of river. And I do, after saying that, need to make it really clear. I don't speak for the state of Colorado. I can't. So the state of Colorado probably doesn't agree with me on that one. I think it should. And I think the reality is we have used politics and said we can't go below 11. And in fact, I don't blame Tom. He's worried he's going to get arrested if he even, when he steps foot back in Arizona, if he says 11's a fair number. We have to plan for less. We have to understand what's going on. And if it doesn't materialize that we're at a 9 million acre foot river, that's okay. But you don't plan a system on hope or politics. Well, we do, and this is where we ended up, right? So let's try to be realistic in our planning and our fairness. But the bottom line is, agriculture does have to come to the table and reduce their use. And again, working with agriculturalists all of my career, they deal with it, and they're used to dealing with it in the upper basin. In a dry year, even in our federal projects, they know they're going to get a percentage of their normal allotment. In our non-federal ditches and irrigated acres, they don't get a declaration as to how little their share is going to be. They just don't get water in their ditch. And what do they do in those years? They don't irrigate their marginal land. They know what the least productive land is on their farms and on their ranches, and they don't irrigate that. And so what we need programmatically is to help the agricultural industry do what they know how to do, which is select the lands that are most productive, keep them in business, because we all eat food. I love the lettuce that comes out of the lower basin. I love all the wintertime vegetables. I don't want them to go away, even though we think they use too much water from our upper basin perspective. We need that vegetable garden. We need domestic water or domestic food production. We need local food production. If the pandemic and the war in Ukraine are teaching us anything, it's keep your food local, right? So how do we do that? We help ag become part of the solution as the pie shrinks.
Andy. Everybody's
going to have to give up something. So let's do it.
I'm coming in to say thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna try and keep the comments around 7 to 8 minutes. We got started just a little bit late. I want to make sure everybody has a chance, and that we have a chance. We've already got a bunch of comments coming in on Slido. So thank you, Andy. Thank you, Meena. Eric, I think you're taking it up.
Yeah, thanks. I do have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to be very specific and address a very narrow issue. But we're talking about the compact, and to me, the compact is a very narrow document. And I want to address a specific issue we heard about yesterday. We heard some differences of opinion between Ann Castle and others about whether we should amend the compact or whether it's flexible enough. And I thought I would add my 10 rubles into that, which is about what it's worth. The question I'm asking is the 1922 compact still an equitable division? And remember, the compact's purpose was to provide for an equitable apportionment of the use, and it's the beneficial consumptive use, between two basins. It didn't do anything among the 7 states. It didn't address the tribes. It didn't address, our non-consumptive uses, except power. So with that question related to the compact, is it still an equitable division? And my answer is blank no. I said no, but after hearing this morning's, I would put a little emphasis there. My general view is the fixed apportionments and flow obligations that from at Lee Ferry that come out of that compact are just fundamentally incompatible with the deep uncertainty and the diminishing natural flows we have in the river. Because of the combined, we heard that also from Amy this morning, because of the combined effects of the compact and what erodification is doing to the basin, the primary impacts of climate change are falling on the upper basin. And I want to throw in there and say, yes, the lower basin tributaries are also impacted. It seems we almost never talk about lower basin tributaries, even though, as we heard from Professor McDonald, the compact was a division of the Colorado River system between two basins. So quickly, the upper basin's problem, and I got in trouble when I first started using this by some folks in Colorado. is that comes from Clifford Stone. Who was Clifford Stone? He was the first director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. In many ways, he really was the heir to Delph Carpenter of the leadership in the Upper Basin. He wasn't at the compact, but in his words, he had many, many conversations with Carpenter. And he basically was also the Upper Basin's compact commissioner, or the Colorado's compact commissioner for the 48 compact. He was the chairman of the Committee of 14 that advised the State Department during the Mexican Treaty. So he was a very influential individual, and he knew a lot about both compacts. His comment in his report to the General Assembly and the governor after the Upper Basin Compact was negotiated includes the following. And I'll basically say, you can read the earlier part, I'll go to the emphasis. The water available for the use in the Upper Basin is that remaining after the Leaf Area delivery requirements are satisfied. When I first, threw out this, I got a call from a young AG at the Colorado saying that was confidential. You had no business putting that out there. Well, this report was printed, thousands of them were printed. They were delivered to every newspaper and about every ditch company in the state. This whole thing was reprinted word for word in the legislative record. So I guess that's a good way to treat confidential material. So anyway, so that's the basic problem. Now, going on with Ann Castle's themes, we have a math problem. The Upper Basin has a math problem. It has a fixed numerator and a shrinking denominator. That fixed numerator is those obligations at Leaf Area. One of the smaller elephants in the room is the Upper Basin's obligation to Mexico. We heard Amy say 75/10 this morning. Well, 52 years ago, the Secretary of Interior decided to make a minimum objective release of 8.23 million acre feet, which includes 750,000 for Mexico. The Upper Basin states, Upper Division states, strenuously objected to that, but it's still there. It's a little elephant in the room. So basically, if you use 825, assuming we have, and I understand it's disputed, but use the large number, you can see that obligation at Leaf Area in the 40s was about 50%. Based on the last 11 years, it's 70%. So that's what I call the Upper Basin squeeze. And that's a problem. And that's why this compact that only divides the consumptive use of water between two basins is, in my personal view, no longer equitable. Real quickly, 12.85 is an interesting number. That's 8.25 at Leaf Area plus what the Upper Basin is using. The black line there is the 10-year running average. Why did I use 10-year running average? That's the compact issue. And you can see beginning mid-2000s, we're really at the point where we're using all the water in the system in the Upper Basin for our use and for our delivery obligations. And in recent years, out there beginning in about 2020, we've gone below that. My view is it doesn't make any sense. Let's assume that some advice, that the states can agree that the Upper Basin doesn't have a compact, an obligation to Mexico. Unlikely that Arizona would ever agree to that, but let's assume it does. In my view, that doesn't fix the problem. Replacing one fixed obligation with another slightly smaller fixed obligation when the river is diminishing just buys you time. Now, it'll buy time, it doesn't fix the problem. Can we fix the problem? Yes. I'm asking everyone to use their imagination. Let's allocate the use of water based on the amount of water we have, not fixed apportionments or flow obligations that were invented 100 years ago. Let's acknowledge that climate change, not that the Upper Basin depletions, is the primary cause of the flow dropping below 75 or 82.5, whatever your number is. And, when I talk to everyone outside, at this room, they all acknowledge climate change is the problem. Climate change is the problem. So let's just acknowledge that under Article 3 of the Compact, that the Upper Basin only using 4 million acre feet is not the cause. of going below these issues. And so you can see, I think we can develop an alternative that looks at available storage and looks at hydrologic index and allocate shortages, or on the other side of the coin, water supply based on the water we have. And with that, I'll just summarize it to say we need to manage the river we have today, not the one we thought we had 100 years ago, or the one that many people wish we had today. An upper basin strategy to reduce fixed deliveries is a short-term fix. A more equitable solution is to share the impacts of climate change. And this, I think, is possible with imagination under the 22 Compact. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack Schmidt. Let me see. Oh, here we go. Let me just say, I'm going to talk about what does it mean to consider the environment and river ecosystems as part of the conversation. And my plea is going to be for more precision in our conversation. Although I'm talking about river environments, I represent no environmental group. I don't know that any environmental group would have me. I'm just a professor who teaches at the Country Bumpkin School 90 miles to the north of here. But I've spent 40 years of my life studying the river and how rivers work and how the Colorado River has changed. But I'm also going to talk based on my experience for 3.5 years when I took leave from the university and had the privilege to lead the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center working within the federal government. So the first point I want to make is the challenge of talking about the river and how to manage river ecosystems really is quite a challenge. On this plot, there are 5 key gauging stations, and in red is the average hydrology of those rivers, whether it's the key gauging stations on the green, the Upper Colorado and the San Juan, Lee's Ferry, and then at Yuma, what those rivers were like when the compact was negotiated. That is the average hydrology of the river in the 1920s and the 19-teens. And in blue is the river today. That is the average hydrology of the river in the 20 years of the 21st century. And the difference between the red lines and the blue lines is the sum of a changing climate, water diversions, and dams. And that is daunting, that change. And I do think that it is important for us to occasionally talk about the water in the rivers and not just only the graphs of natural flow at Lee's Ferry. This is the real deal. And the question and what drove the system is the annual snowmelt flood. And in the upper basin, there is an annual snowmelt flood, but diminished. And then at Lee's Ferry and in the Grand Canyon, the river is absolutely nothing like what the river was. And then, of course, it is the river no more at Yuma. And so that is an important thing to keep in mind. But the other thing is, when we talk about river ecosystems, we need to distinguish the effects of diverting water from the effects of dam operations. The other point is that river ecosystems have changed also because of the large-scale introduction of non-native species that have completely upset the apple cart on what the attributes of the natural ecosystem are. And those non-native species respond differently to the changes we've imposed. The shading here represents the thermal regime of the modern river when Lake Powell had water in it and relatively cool water was released downstream. Yesterday, there's sometimes this complete focus on, oh, we need in-stream flows and it's all about water. That sure as heck is the case in the Delta. But upstream, the problem of the Colorado River is not water. What's going to change the ecosystems is a change in the thermal regime, because full reservoirs release cool water and low reservoirs release warm water. And what we need to keep in mind is the ecosystems of the modern Colorado River are entirely novel ecosystems that are mixtures of native and non-native species. And they will respond differently to the effects of diversions and dam operations than just native species. And we need to keep that in mind. And the challenge of novel ecosystems is that forces us as a society to play God. Because if they're mixtures of native and non-native species, then humans inevitably play a role in deciding what's important and what do we want to manage for and what not. In terms of geographic precision, when we talk about the Colorado River and we care about the environment, for heaven's sakes, let's be very specific of what part of the river are we talking about. Because the Colorado River above Lake Powell is a relatively natural river that still looks and feels like the river of old. That's absolutely nothing like the Colorado River in the Delta. That is a destroyed, obliterated ecosystem. Or the lower river, in which we have patches of habitat left. Or the Grand Canyon, that's sort of like Disneyland, where we manage the river to produce hydroelectric power and keep enough water in the rapids so we can run 37-foot motor rigs through those rapids. So when we talk about caring about the environment, which part of the river do we care about? We have adaptive management programs. And I want to point out that each one of these adaptive management programs has in its enabling sort of guidelines that it's to improve the environment while allowing the law of the river to be implemented, to improve the conditions while allowing water development to continue. I set myself a timer. Now I know where I'm at. I'm at 7.
Right at 7.
Right, okay. So here's the point. The focus of the adaptive management programs is to hope that by fixing dam operations, you can fix the river. But when the problem is diversions and removing water out of the system, it's naive to think that changing dam operations can necessarily fix the fundamental problem, which is that some parts of the river have no water in them. And it's the Delta, it's the Duchesne River, it's the San Rafael River, it's the Dolores River. And we need to be mindful of that, and that's the challenge. I would submit that we need clear visions of what we want for the river. And the clear vision is not necessarily only recovering the endangered species. Some parts of the river will always only be the working river. It's just going to meet water supply and hydropower, and the environment is catch as catch can, and we do the best we can. But other places, we have an opportunity to have a different kind of a river, and this is the debate we need to have in society. And I want to just say, the pursuit of recovering species with whatever environment it takes, just so long as we recover fish, is not necessarily the environmental outcome for the river. It's one possible way to manage the river. But the other way is to have a natural flow regime. And I think this is the debate, is which kind of a vision for the river do we want in the future? I have my opinions, others would disagree, but this is the debate we need to have if we're going to guide water resource engineers to say, what do we want to optimize and achieve? Thanks.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks, folks. So I am, as Amy said, Jay Weiner, and I am a lawyer and therefore need to start with a disclaimer, which is that my perspective on the basin is shaped very heavily by the work that I am privileged to do on behalf of the Kitsan tribe. And the Kitsan tribe has made it a high tribal priority to involve itself to try to take a leadership role in Colorado River Basin governance issues to make sure that it is maximizing the benefits of its water rights for the tribe and its members. And its commitment to that effort is demonstrated by the fact that we have 3 tribal council members here today. We have President Joaquin and Councilman Escalante and Councilman Melanson. And then we also have the tribe's water technician, Frank Venegas, here today. And I will also give a shout out to Celine Hawkins and the Nature Conservancy, because it was resources the Nature Conservancy was able to provide to the tribe that helped the tribe bring Frank on board during COVID, where otherwise there would not have been tribal resources to do it. So my disclaimer is that while my perspective is heavily shaped by that, I do have other clients in the Colorado River Basin, but most importantly, the views that I express today are my own and should not necessarily be ascribed to, and certainly should not be blamed on my clients. So with that, the question of equity and what equity means, and I mean, I think you've heard the various speakers already tee this up, and I think one of the things that it lays bare is that how you answer the question of what equity is depends very dramatically on where you start from. I mean, Andy talked about ag, and Jack talked about species. Meena from a water perspective. What is equitable? What is an equitable share? We've certainly heard a fair amount, and again, I confess I come from a heavily lower basin perspective. But we hear about the disequity the upper basin suffers because of not having a fixed allocation. At the same time, the upper basin states, with no additional disrespect intended, are terrible at measuring water. They can't tell you how much they're using. They engross perhaps, but they don't gauge it. They don't measure it. And is it fair, therefore, to try to take out of a lower basin share, which is measured to the drop, and accounted for and managed, when the upper basin doesn't have its water management house in order? And that's a prior appropriation problem. I mean, so where is there equity there? Is there not equity there? On the ag question, I mean, Andy talked about the local growers and the local economies that rely on them, and that's a really important interest. And frankly, it's a sustainable interest. I mean, are we talking about, when we talk about ag, are we talking about sustainable ag? Are we talking about the fact that Arizona doesn't have its groundwater house in order, and so alfalfa growers from Saudi Arabia are mining Arizona groundwater and sending it to the Middle East? Is that an equitable thing for the lower basin to be using water on at the expense of others? So where do we start here? And what perspectives do we take into account when we think about what is equitable? And obviously, it's not the elephant in the room. Daryl did a fantastic job this morning actually saying many of the things that I was going to say, but he said them better, of how unequitable it is, the way that tribes have been included or not included in the basin for the better part of a century. And part of what that therefore brings in is also the question of what sort of time horizon are we measuring equity along? I mean, if you want my suggestion for what an equitable solution for the basin would look like, we've had 100 years of the basin states managing the basin. Let's take 100 years, let the basin tribes manage the basin, reconvene in 21, 22, compare notes, and see where we go from there. Sounds fair to me. Although I used the word fair there, which is interesting. And I noted, I think it was Andy who mentioned the word fair. And what is fair is not necessarily what is equitable. I mean, you have time horizons. You have this question of, and this is certainly an intrastate issue in all of the prior appropriation states, within and outside of the basin. Do we get to a point where we prioritize among categories of beneficial use? Is there a human, California has a human right to water now. Is there, and as a default matter, there is, at least in urban areas, a sense that money will be spent, federal dollars, state dollars, on providing clean drinking water and water for human sanitation needs. That is not the case in significant chunks of Indian country in this basin. It is also a challenge that non-Indian rural communities face. Is it equitable? Is it fair? Is it a good management practice that you have communities where you have individuals' groundwater wells for their basic human needs that essentially rely on inefficient irrigation? And if you make irrigation efficiencies to improve the water use there, the knock-on effects that you see from that on rural community water supplies who don't have the population or the resource to rate base what it is that they need to do to provide communal drinking water. Is that an equitable solution as water flows uphill to money as it has in Western water? This question of equity is a tough one. And one of the things that really gives rise to is, you've heard it from this panel, you've heard it from other speakers in the conference, right? We're all here sitting up on the panel today, and we're all here sitting in the audience because we come from particular perspectives and particular backgrounds and have particular experiences and particular interests. But one of the things that fundamentally has to happen in this basin, and it hasn't happened for a century when it comes to tribes, certainly, and times of crisis make it even harder to do. But one of the things that fundamentally has to happen is that we all need to commit ourselves to using some imaginative empathy. It is not just about how can I defend the corner that I know. It is about trying to think about how to interact and engage and interface with people who you view as your competitors. Because otherwise there is no way to build, and there is no way to talk, and there is no way to communicate. And it was interesting. Meena picked up on this as well. Amy's comment this morning about a full reservoir of trust. There is certainly not a full reservoir of trust when it comes from Indian country. And one of the things that is going to be telling over the next set of years as we deal with the short-term and the long-term crises that we're facing is whether the nice words that the basin has learned to say over the past decade or so about equity and tribal inclusion and all of those things, whether they're going to be followed up by meaningful action. We're very excited to hear Assistant Secretary Trujillo yesterday talk about the process that Secretary Holland is going to kick off, because we've been waiting. I'll say quite candidly that there was a coalition of 20 basin tribes who sent the Secretary a letter in November explaining with great particularity what it is that those tribes want and expect to see from the administration as we move toward the process of a 2026 framework. And essentially the first letter that we got back from the Secretary said, okay, great, thank you. Let's have a listening session so that I can hear your concerns. That was not the engagement we're looking for, and to the administration's credit, they are working to improve on that. But it's not enough to listen when you don't hear, and it's not enough to hear when you don't act. And that's one of the reasons that I highlighted at the beginning the contribution that TNC made to help the Kitsan tribe actually build capacity, because that is a real-world fundamental change that is growing the tribe's internal capacity to measure and manage its water. And the tribe was fortunate that Frank was available and interested in the job. And he's a tribal member. And I strongly agree with the points that Meena and that Andy made about the need to broaden and diversify the talent base. I say this to my clients, and I actually mean it, that my goal ultimately is to put myself out of a job and get replaced by a tribal lawyer. That is where, at least for the clients that I work with, we all want to get to. But so again, there's this question of, well, what is equitable and where does this go? And another reason I bring up the notion of imaginative empathy is because there is a lot of talk in the basin about, okay, so we all know we've got to do better by tribes. We all know we need to bring them into governance discussions, but there's 30 tribes in the basin. How do we do that? And I will be honest, I don't think the 30 tribes in the basin yet necessarily have the right answer for that either. But I will say that we are getting very tired of, after a century of ignoring us, the basin now wants us to tell you how to engage with us. Y'all need to figure out how to bring us in. We will help you, and we will think about it too. But after a century of exclusion, we don't necessarily know how your internal processes work. So help us navigate them.
Thank you, Jay. Excellent. Thank you all. This is a robust topic that I believe deserves more than just an hour and a half, and that would also benefit from a larger cast of characters, which is the first question that I'd like to ask that I've received on Slido, but also that I would like to ask as a result of our conversation, which is, before we talk about strategies, what is the process for talking about what equity is? Because equity not only means many different things to many different people, but it also, who defines it? Who defines what is equitable? And it matters who's represented, who's heard, and who's recognized. And so the process for determining that, I think, is very important, building off the last panel where we talked about processes as well. So I'll open this up to the panel to ask, what would a process for determining equity and who defines it look like?
I mean, I could start. I can tell you, I worked at the Bureau of Reclamation when the 2007 guidelines were done. From the inside of Reclamation, it seemed like we knew what we were doing. And now I work for Metropolitan Water District, and I'm outside of that process. And even I'm a little perplexed about what it looks like. And I do, think my federal friends are trying really hard to manage all of their stakeholders. But I'm not quite sure what the process is yet. I keep hearing we're going to start having, formal talks soon, but I don't think that's actually happened. I think the lower basin's talking to each other. The upper basin, I think, is apparently investigating together. And so I don't know what the actual process looks like yet.
So from my perspective, it's going to take, and I think that Jack's point about the need to look with granularity and particularity is one that applies across the basin to a whole set of issues that we're dealing with. But if the process is going to look different than the last 100 years, which from, my slightly cynical perspective essentially is that the states figure out what they can live with and the feds nod their head and we move along. So side note there, like the discussion about whether we need to rewrite the compact or not rewrite the compact, again, from a more removed perspective, that seems to not be the right question, because ultimately the law of the river is whatever 7 basin states in the United States decide it is. I don't know that the compact necessarily needs to be either sacrosanct or viewed as an immovable obstacle either way. But from a process standpoint, to ensure meaningful tribal inclusion and to break a lot of the habits and the muscle memory that the basin states and stakeholders have, from my perspective, it is essential for the United States to convene the top table. And the top table needs to include the United States and the basin states and some coalition of tribes from the upper and lower basin. There will be a million other conversations that have to happen. There will be intrastate, there will be interstate, there will be intertribal, there will be, ag and stakeholders and wherever you can find either people to build consensus with or people you really feel a need to pick a fight with. All of those things will go on and will feed into the discussion and the decision making. But I am very skeptical that we will see meaningful tribal inclusion unless it is a federally led process that specifically creates seats for tribes at the table, because I have no confidence that when the chips are down, the basin states will do anything other than, and I don't mean to pick on Tom at all, because the constraints that Arizona faces are real, but because of the constraints that Arizona, for example, faces, what we're going to see is a winnowing. There is going to be a jettisoning of things that we maybe want to deal with and a focus on the absolute core things that people feel are essential. And that may well boil down to another set of coordinated reservoir operations. And there will be a perception that that's not something that tribes need to be involved with in the same way, which is not true. I mean, there are huge implications for the reservoir operations for the tribes in the basin. And frankly, that is true even for another one of my clients whose hydrologic connection to the water of the Colorado River for purposes of using the water on the reservation is inordinately attenuated. But we have a WAPA contract. And so even though my client is a Central Arizona tribe, we care a whole heck of a lot about how the reservoir management decisions in the upper basin are made. And without those interests being able to have voice and input and meaningful input into the decisions that are going to get made, we will not have meaningfully changed. And again, to not pick on Tom, because I think Tom, one, probably does have one of the harder jobs in the basin, and two, I appreciate that he speaks candidly about what the Arizona process looks like. But the Arizona process that Tom described this morning essentially is Arizona has now learned, and there's the ITCA partnership, that it's good for them to come and talk to the Arizona tribes and talk about what their plans are. And that's a good step, but that's not putting tribes in the room when the plans get made in the first place.
Let me just give a shout out to the work of the Water and Tribes Initiative on capacity. And let me just talk about capacity for a minute. Because we keep talking about, let's get more people sitting at the table. And just the one vignette from my time leading GCMRC, which is the science provider to the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. There's a lot of people who sit at that table, each of the 7 states, 5 tribes with spiritual and cultural connection to Grand Canyon, the power industry, the environmental community, recreation. That's a lot of people. Now, that group inevitably dives into the minutiae of river science and river engineering. But it's a very unequal distribution of influence of people who sit at the table. Because some of the entities who sit at that table have full-time staffs of people whose job it is to just focus on that place or to just go from one meeting to the next meeting ad nauseum. And other people are the volunteer river guide who flies in from Durango and helps as he can and then leaves. And the tribal representatives are inevitably drawn in a million different directions. And so you have a completely unequal distribution of the capacity to deal with technical issues and really meaningfully contribute. And that's a problem. So it's not, there are some high-level issues which are so simple and straightforward as sovereign to sovereign relations and all that are not technical. But at some level, the more you drill down to the details, the more staff capacity really makes a difference. And then the other problem is going to be if you just say the staff capacity is going to be met by reclamation doing all the behind-the-scenes modeling of CRSS or what have you, well, reclamation only has so many people who can do that, right? And so I think that we have to begin to say, what's the issue? And then how do people contribute? Just getting to sit at the table is not the only answer. Can you sit at the table and contribute in a meaningful way? And what are the resources you need to be there in a meaningful way?
If I could just hop on that quickly, Jack, which your question is a good one, but that also goes back to the notion of timescale. Let's get to the table. Let's make sure we get to the table and we can deal with the capacity issues as we go along.
Great. So we've received a lot of questions from the audience about what choices would have to be made to support local ag in the basin as a water use strategy, and who is growing that ag.
You're closer to ag than I am. Oh, I can make something up.
I think as a community, we have to decide. He talked about having fruits, in the winter. We all have a choice to make, and this goes to Brad Udall's comment about how we emit emissions into the air, and that's causing the climate change, or is causing our flows to be lower. We have a choice. Do you want salad year-round? Do you want, peaches all the time? Do you want almonds? You make the choice as a consumer in your grocery store, at your farmer's market. And so that drives the market, and that drives what farmers are going to grow. They are very smart business people, and they will feed you if you're willing to buy their produce and consume their goods. And so I don't know how you control that except out of your own pockets.
The one thing I would add to that, though, and this is true with climate change, and this is true with the notion that we're not going to recycle our way out of it. Yes, consumer choices are critical, but we also, and this is one of the things that the basin runs into, that the problems we're facing press on multiple huge axes. I mean, we're living in a world where United States agricultural policy for the last 50 years has subsidized and prioritized and privileged consolidation and growth. We don't have a national ag system that supports sustainable local agriculture. And so you as a consumer can make choices, but your choices likely are only going to matter around the margins unless there is honest to God political muscle put behind it.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. It's a consumer choice issue. One of the issues I frequently hear about and would say is near and dear to the hearts of many of my constituents is the 80% of the water consumed in agriculture in the Colorado River Basin is in forage crops that then go into beef. And you look at the water consumption in the beef industry, and it's huge. And it's easy to attack that, but we as consumers all choose, not all, many of us choose to eat beef and meat. And so, where does that responsibility lie? It does lie with all of us, but it lies in the federal policy and in state policies. Our state has evolved and is evolving. I will say not without controversy. Our Department of Agriculture is supporting and trying to support local production. Even the Biden administration, you see, supporting funding more meat processing, local efforts to diversify the meat processing industry. But how do you make it truly local and still manage to feed the entire population, right? That's probably not entirely possible. So there's some balance there that you have to meet. But it is, I think, I guess, a recognition that ag is extremely important. And how do you do it in the best possible way?
Yeah, I want to just real quickly point out, I think I've said in the past that the future of the Colorado River is all about managing grass. There's a lot of ornamental pasture land that is not used for agriculture. I live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of irrigated pasture land, and a few neighbors had some pet donkeys a few years ago. They're gone, but we still irrigate year in, year out. So there is most of the Front Range from I-25, to the mountains is I use the word hobby farms or whatever, but there's a lot of ornamental turf that uses Colorado River water that doesn't provide anything other than a good view of the mountains, a green view of the mountains. And we should start by looking at that. How's Las Vegas succeeded? They've succeeded by dealing with non-productive turf, and I think the rest of us can do that as well. And that includes some land that we traditionally call ag land, which has some great value, especially in western Colorado, because it's the open space. That open space is the only thing that keeps Colorado Springs from Denver being one town. So, we do have some hard choices, but I do think there is a lot of, I would call, turf out there in the system that is nice to have, but it doesn't do anything for us other than to consume water.
I just want to point out that Southern Nevada Water Agency did pass legislation to take it out, like Eric said. And Metropolitan pays, and its member agencies pays about $3 per square foot to have turf removed. And so that's been a very successful program. And those are just another example of how Metropolitan and the urbans have been trying to deal with this issue. We'll see if California can get to where Nevada went, but it takes a lot of political will and leadership to get there.
Okay, I'm going to switch topics here. There's a question here that I think is really compelling in terms of deepening our inquiry into equity, which is there is a lot of emphasis on technical capacity and sound data. We've certainly heard that at this conference, as if this is a prerequisite for a seat at the table. But what about Indigenous values and their science? Is that enough for a seat at the table? And how would that deepen the conversation?
This is where me being the white guy lawyer is not helpful.
Nor this panel.
I-
However, I think it's important for us to consider this because it is up to all of us to expand the conversation about equity and have a curiosity and a willingness to include different perspectives in our technical conversations.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with that, and I think that some of it goes to, and I'm a lawyer, I'll pick at the question. Seat at the table. Like, what are we? Which tables? Which conversations? I think that there is absolutely a need for indigenous knowledge, indigenous perspectives. I think there is a need to learn and to pay attention to how it is that cultures and societies survived in the Colorado River Basin for thousands of years with massive swings in climate variability. Because one of the things that's driving the crisis now is that what we clearly are recognizing is that the status quo is not sustainable. And there were Colorado River native societies who, when the climate changed, moved. That was an adaptation. That's certainly not an adaptation being talked about in the basin right now as to whether this basin actually can support 40 million people on the water budget we seem to be likely to have. So again, the question is, what is it we're willing to contemplate? What sort of changes to the status quo are people open to? And there is not just a place for indigenous knowledge and indigenous culture, but frankly, I don't think the basin is going to survive without it.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think Nora's discussion yesterday was really powerful in that it really brought home the importance of the river to many of our native tribes. And I just want to tie into that, our district in Western Colorado, we have, inside the district I'm in, we don't have actually any reservation lands. But we went to to the voters about 2 years ago to ask to double our income to help sustain and adapt to climate change, and it passed overwhelmingly in a very anti-tax region, very conservative, very opposed to government region, and our entire message was we are all bound by the river, and frankly, it's probably a bit of cultural appropriation in our concept there. It is really important to realize that everybody in this room, upper, lower basin, the artificial divides that we've placed in here, we are all bound by this same river, and we have to learn from cultures that aren't this traditional Anglo perspective on data, and you even sit here and talk about the tables and how we get in the door. That's all important. But we also have to realize the human connection and the natural connection we all have and relate to it that way. And we had the incredibly diverse support for that election at the same time that we saw the most divisive presidential election in modern history. And so how do we expand upon that? And I think learning from and leaning on our native culture is probably really important to that.
If I could also hop back in with just one other point, which is adding to the conversation from the perspectives is critical. But I think the other piece is that there is also sometimes a cult of data. And there needs to be a recognition that even Anglo-Western science, whatever, is a process of uncertainty and of trial and error. Brad threw up the USGS projections that gave us between 9 and 17 million acre feet. Okay, let's go where the science takes us. Data only goes so far, and data does not exist in a vacuum. And how you choose to use data and how you choose to manage for uncertainty is critical. And this notion that somehow there is like indigenous knowledge over here and science over there, and that one is either crystalline and pure and tested, and that the other is woohoo, or alternately that one or the other necessarily encompasses all of what is right now a fairly unprecedented situation we're dealing with, risks devaluing and losing the ability to benefit from what is useful and important from both.
Great. So we have 3 minutes really two. And I'd like to ask the panelists if you have any one small, bright idea to share for us to take forward and consider. 2 minutes.
I'm just going to go because I'm not shy. I mean, the one, and genuinely getting back to actually what, the topic that we landed on of strategies to equitably share water. There are two critical things that need to happen from my perspective as an Indian country advocate to make this basin work given the challenges that we face, and they need to both happen simultaneously. One of which is that there fundamentally needs to be investment to make sure that every person in this basin, particularly on reservations, has access to basic water for human and sanitation needs. The fact that we are living in 21st century America with people disproportionately, as Daryl mentioned this morning, dying from COVID because they don't have access to clean running water is beyond scandalous, it is beyond offensive, and it has to have changed 100 years ago. That's one thing that has to happen. The other thing that has to happen, because we all see the numbers, we all see the trends, we all see the data, we all recognize that the tension between the basin's need to live with a smaller water budget and tribes' needs to be able to benefit from their water rights that historically have been under-resourced and underdeveloped are in some fundamental tension if the incentive system remains what it has been viewed as, which is that the only currency of the realm is conserved consumptive use. If all we are going to monetize and pay for is conserved consumptive use, you have cut most of the basin's tribes out of the game from the beginning. And what needs to change, and Kuhn has been a pioneer in this, working with Metropolitan Water, which is compensated forbearance. It is to pay tribes to not develop the water so that benefits can be derived by the tribes from that water without adding to the structural deficit. And until the basin gets serious about moving away from conserved consumptive use as being the only coin of the realm, the basin is not serious about integrating tribal water rights into the mix.
Anybody? At the risk of going from the sublime to the ridiculous, let me offer my last thought. As far as I'm concerned, river science is not positioned to inform and support the renegotiation of the interim guidelines in going forward. That the river science organizations of the basin are all focused on dam re-operations and the minutiae of that. And the existence of those programs that as they exist today should not be assumed that they're ready to support reclamation and the conversation of the so what of changing patterns of use. I do not think that the environment is ever going to guide the ultimate decision of how to manage the river. But the key people negotiating how water consumptive use should go forward and how it should be distributed certainly want to know the trade-off between, well, if we have more water in this section, what do we get out of that? What's the environmental change? We're not in a position to inform those trade-offs. So we're not in a position to inform the stakeholders or the key people who will make those decisions, whoever they may be, the traditional or tribal peoples. And so we need to reorganize river science so we're ready to help that. And the fact that I said that the Delta is an obliterated environment does not mean we shouldn't be working there or that the great things that are going on there shouldn't continue. It's just a different kind of a strategy. It's not restoring what was there 100 years ago. We're making a place a different and a better place. That's all I would say.
And I would just end with, we can't say that we're all in this together if we're not willing to make sacrifices and recognizes the choices that we need to make. And as Amy and Bitta said, I think we are at living in an equity moment. I think our values have changed over time, and I think we need to embrace collaboration and partnerships and new ideas and innovative thinking. And so I just can't see a future where we fail. And I have an 11-year-old little boy, and we're not going to fail. He's going to have a river.
Very
right?
good.
I would just add, we should never accept that we can't implement a good idea because of the law of the river says we can't, because somebody who interprets the law of the river out there says we can't.
That's a great
And
point.
I would just add one last thing. It's to avoid the tragedy of the commons, we have to recognize the legitimate needs of every person and being in this river basin and make sure we meet them and not pit each other against each other.
Thank you very much. I do just want to reiterate that we are at an equity moment in this basin. And I feel like it's an opportunity for us all to become more fluent in our own humanity, our own ability to reach out and understand each other, and really step forward and shape what our future looks like. So thank you all for participating. Thank you all for your questions. Appreciate your time.